This is the day I have longed for. It has now come at long last, like a dream which has come true. My life has been burdened by an awful responsibility and anxiety. It has been a life full of the deepest emotions that a woman has ever had. The Swazi nation placed me in charge of the affairs of the country as queen in place of the dead king, and I have served as regent during the minority of two subsequent kings. Bunu died after only a very short life, leaving me with the responsibility of bringing up his infant son and heir. I rejoice that I now present him to your honor in your capacity as the head of the administration of Swaziland. He is very young, as your honor can see. He shall constantly require my advice. I and the nation have every confidence in him. I have brought him up. His spirit is entirely in accord with the traditions and the feelings and the aspirations of his countrymen. And what is more, I have given him the opportunity to obtain the very best training which any native youth can obtain here in South Africa. I beg to thank your honor for all the help which you have given me in opening such facilities for the prince's education. His going away from me always gave me pains, which only stopped when I saw him return, having grown in status and knowledge. In him, I feel that I have done as his grandmother and queen all that I could do. In conclusion, I desire to introduce to the representatives of His Royal Highness, the High Commissioner, this, my grandson, Sobhuza II, the paramount chief of Swaziland and king of the Swazi nation. In doing this, I commend him to your friendly assistance and help. During my time, I've had the friendly help of 5 noble high commissioners of this country. I thank them all for their assistance, which has always been readily and willingly given to the administration, and will henceforth address all its communications directly to him. Sobhuza II gets his name, title, and position by the right of inheritance from his ancient house and kings who have ruled over the Swazi nation from time immemorial. I have brought him up as a Swazi prince ought to be brought up, but I cannot give him my experience. That was a speech delivered by Queen Regent Labotsibeni on the 22nd of December 1921 at the royal capital in Zimbabwe. She would have been about 60 years old, 4 years before she passes away. Before her were the British administrators, and standing beside her was the proud product of her tutelage, her grandson, Sobhuza II, who would go on to his own storied career. He's justifiably probably the most famous king in all of Swaziland. On that day, his grandmother was handing to him a fragile but very real authority and legitimacy. An authority and legitimacy she had almost plucked from the jaws of oblivion. I wanted to start with it because Labotsibeni is my entry point into Swazi history. She was the prism through which I was able to view Swazi history with all its scope and interest. I am sort of very Carlylean in my view of history. While I appreciate Marxist and structuralist readings of history, for me to get into history, I need big characters. And Labotsibeni resonated with me because she reminds me of a character I read about in a John Gardner book, Maestro. This was a book that kept me company in boarding school. The character's name in the book was Constanza Trachia. I could be pronouncing that incorrectly. In the book, she's portrayed as a great operatic singer. She's absolutely brilliant, but she's also, shall we say, incredibly theatrical and dramatic in her personal life. She's a larger-than-life character. The sobriquet they give her in the book is La Tempesta, the tempest, the storm. For me, Labotsibeni resembled her. I mean, the sobriquet she had throughout her life was Gwamile. In Siswati, this means the indomitable one, the one that endures. I was so taken with the Queen Regent that I wrote 2 essays on her after all. And there's a paragraph in one of those 2 essays that nicely encapsulates why I find her so fascinating. And I'd like to read it. I'm sure it seems a little narcissistic to read your own essay, but you'll quickly come to realize it's in keeping with my character. So, about Labotsibeni and my fascination with her, I write, and I quote, "She did not have the privilege of reading Mahan, studying Bismarck's career, nor enjoy even a cursory acquaintanceship with world history. Yet her conduct as a statesman fills me with pride. She was a sovereign who, at the apex of her career, was the match of any strategist in the foreign offices or state departments of the major powers. The Edward Greys and Sergei Sazanovs of the world could certainly marshal greater material resources, lay claim to a richer intellectual heritage, and exercise their talents on a wider field of action. But I would be loath to believe that they could draw on greater mental and psychological reserves than that extraordinary woman who governed my country for 32 long years. It is in this sense, then, that despite the ignorance, through no fault of her own, the confusion and shock that must have been the burden of her generation in general, and hers in particular, that she acquitted herself with a confidence and ability I have no right to expect. This is why I'm so enamored of her. This is why I found her so interesting. Her career was marked by the sustained act of political will against all the odds, a political will she had single-mindedly directed at the preservation of the Swazi monarchy's legitimacy. This is in light of the fact that the monarchy's institutional and administrative power had been curbed in 1890 by the triumvirate government, and then in 1894 by the propagation of the Organic Proclamation that created a protectorate out of Swaziland and handed it to the South African Republic. She was able to transform herself into the center of national life, the lodestar around which the nation's energies were organized. She became a very modern figure, a populist, if you will. She was the greatest advocate of the interests and aspirations of the Swazi people. And her story, her career, from 1889 to 1921, is for me one of the great political stories. And I think it's important to understand the backdrop of her ascension to power and why her career was so extraordinary. The key date here is the 7th of October, 1889. On that day, King Mbandzeni lay dying. He would be the last Swazi king to enjoy full sovereignty in Swaziland until the post-colonial era. Throughout his calamitous reign, he would sell over 100 concessions to European traders, speculators, and frankly, brigands, land rights, mining rights, and most inexcusably of all, he sold a concession on the royal revenue to agents of the South African Republic. This is the same South African Republic that sought to annex Swaziland, use it as a land bridge into Mozambique so they could circumvent British-controlled ports in South Africa and gain a non-British port in Mozambique. He sold the concession on the royal revenue to those agents. This was doubly calamitous and perverse, not only because it destroyed the fiscal capabilities of the monarchy, but because those revenues granted administrative controls to the proprietor. It is the equivalent of granting someone customs duties. For them to effectuate their right, they need to be able to station customs officials. This is what Mbandzeni had done. The comparison that comes to mind is the granting of the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa by the Mughals to the British East India Company. And if you know anything about Mughal history, the Mughals never recovered from that. It was a singularly perverse act on Mbandzeni's part. He had almost irrevocably sold his and the country's patrimony to foreign agents. I had come to the history, frankly, with a low opinion of him. In Swazi history, he is portrayed as being kind-hearted, but having been duped by Europeans. On the first of those measures, I found it quite true that he was kind-hearted. An anecdote that I think exemplifies the man's kindness has to do with Mbandzeni's treatment of one of the great warriors in Swazi history, Dlamini. To really explain this, I need to go back further towards Mbandzeni's ascension to the throne. Mbandzeni came to the throne after the premature death of the young king-to-be, Ndwandwe. And because Swaziland is a dual monarchy, where mother serves with son, Ndwandwe's mother, Cecilia Khumalo, would need to take a son to replace the deceased crown prince. She settled on Mbandzeni because Mbandzeni's mother had passed away, and frankly, because she thought Mbandzeni would be pliant. And for a very long time, he was. However, with time, because Cecilia was not his actual mother, and the institution of the dual monarchy. In fact, I think it's important for me to describe the way this relationship should work when it is functioning perfectly. There's an anthropologist, Hilda Cooper, who's written an excellent anthropological study of Swaziland. The book is An African Aristocracy, Rank Amongst the Swazis. And in it, Hilda Cooper writes, describing the institution of the dual monarchy. And I quote, "Between the Ingwenyama, the lion or king, and the Indlovukati, the she-elephant or queen mother, there is a delicate balance of powers, legal, economic, and ritual. He presides over the highest court, and formally, he alone could pronounce the death sentence. But she is in charge of the second highest court. Her counselors may take part in the discussions at her son's court, and her hut is a sanctuary, even to men sentenced to death. He controls the entire army, but the commander-in-chief may reside at the Queen Mother's village. He has his own chosen regiment stationed at his home. She has regiments at the capital under the leadership of princes. He has the power to distribute land. Together they work the rain that fructifies the soul. He may take cattle from the royal herds. She may rebuke him if he wastes national wealth. She is the custodian of the sacred objects of the nation, but they are not effective without his cooperation in manipulating them. He represents the line of past kings. She speaks to the dead in the shrine hut of the capital and provides beer for the libations. He is made great and rejuvenated in the annual ceremony held at her home. She receives special treatment on that occasion and takes precedence over other participants. In all activities, they should assist and advise each other, for he is Inkosi, a king, and she is also Inkosi, a king. Together, they are spoken of as twins, and when one dies, the other must be more strongly fortified than for any other national or personal loss. This is the relationship, then, that exists between mother and son in the dual monarchy. And it is even more delicate because very often the Queen Mother will serve as chief executive alone because the king in Swaziland elected as a minor. And so there is a regency period almost for every reign. This was the relationship then between Cecilia and Mbandzeni. But because Cecilia was not Mbandzeni's biological mother, and because she was a woman with a very strong personality, and I will go into this in later episodes, overreached, tensions between her and Mbandzeni increased. And it is believed that the Queen Mother fomented a coup against the king. Finding out about this, the king is believed to have prepared to move against her decisively. The Queen Mother, fearing for her life, gathered together her regiment and attempted to flee the country towards the South African Republic. The king, Mbandzeni, then dispatched his own regiments, rushing after the Queen Mother. But leading the Queen Mother's regiments was a young man, Dlamini. When the king's regiments collided with the Queen Mother's regiments, the Queen's regiments won out. They subdued and defeated the king's regiments, with the king's regiments suffering heavy losses. Critical to this victory was Dlamini. His exploits on that day made him famous the nation over. He became the preeminent warrior in the nation. However, the king was able to send successive regiments after the queen, eventually defeating and subduing her. But as a sign of the man's magnanimity, he recalled Dlamini, pardoned him, and heaped honors on him. In fact, Dlamini was to end up one of the great pillars of the aristocracy. And I think that is not the mark of a small-minded man. That is the mark of a great soul. Unfortunately, that magnanimity was not combined with a fortitude and sharpness of wit, so that later on that day, when Mbandzeni finally passed away, it precipitated a political crisis. Not only because he'd granted these concessions, but because he'd granted overlapping concessions. So Afrikaner, British, and other concessionaries rushed to the country to lay claim to what they considered their stake. But because the royal administration's financial basis and legitimacy had been crushed by Mbandzeni's reign, the Swazis were forced to call in help from the British. A concessions tribunal was set up to clear the overlapping claims, and in 1890, the triumvirate was set up to administer the country. It had a British representative, an Afrikaner representative, and a Swazi representative. The Swazis dispatched Theophilus Shepstone to be their representative, a man not completely trustworthy, but frankly he did his best by the Swazis. In 1894, as I mentioned, we'd later on get a protectorate formed out of Swaziland and then granted to the South African. Throughout this period, the monarchy was left reeling, not only because of these concessions, but because days after Mbandzeni's death, a horrible bloodletting was unleashed that saw the most prominent and able members of the aristocracy murdered. Men like Zwide. Zwide was perhaps, or rather in my estimation, the greatest counselor the state has ever produced. He had risen to prominence under Sobhuza I. He had been a great lieutenant and the chief minister of that great warlike Mswati II. He had been a pillar of state during the minority of Ndwandwe, and he had even served in the ill-starred reign of Mbandzeni, and he was killed for his quiet disapproval of the concessions movement. In fact, along with Ngopolo, one of the chief children of Mswati II, he was leader of the anti-concessions faction. However, he never dared openly move against Mbandzeni, even though he saw him selling away his patrimony. The leader of the concessions movement, a member of the Privy Council, a man for whom avarice, cupidity, and cunning were transformed into an art, the man who was the leader of the concessions faction, moved to destroy first Ngopolo by spreading rumors of a putative coup against Mbandzeni. He was then able to use this as a wedge to drive Mbandzeni against his own brother, having done this when Mbandzeni died, to ensure that when scores were being settled after Mbandzeni's death, he would not have to face up to his crimes. He moved against all the anti-concession faction. So by so doing, Dikuba became, in my estimation, the greatest blackguard in Swazi history. He ripped out the institutional memory of the monarchy at a time when it truly needed it. These were the circumstances that prevailed as the Privy Council was meeting to select the heir to the throne. This is happening in 1889. All of this is happening at the same time. The atmosphere in the room must have been desperate. The members of the Privy Council must have been aware that only a few decades earlier, when the Xhosa had suffered successive shock after shock. They had imploded in the famous cattle movement led by a supposed prophet, Ndwandwe, who in her desperation had seen a prophecy that had told her that the Xhosa would have to cattle, and by so doing, they would drive the whites back into the sea and rejuvenate the people. Of course, this had led to a magnificent famine that had hollowed out the Xhosa. And so, who was to say that the same thing could not befall the Swazis? The fiscal basis of their independence, as I mentioned, had already been smashed. Mbandzeni, and by default, the monarchy's legitimacy was called into question. The number one responsibility Mbandzeni had throughout his lifetime was to steward and protect the patrimony entrusted to him as head of the nation. He had singularly failed in that, and social cohesion, the glue that binds the nation together, was clearly in tatters, with members of the aristocracy hunting each other down. The Privy Council were clearly aware of this. And so, in making their decision, they violated all the strictures of customary law in Swaziland as it relates to the succession, because they understood that the importance of picking someone strong and intelligent superseded custom in that moment. And so, they alighted on a 30-year-old woman, Labotsibeni Mdluli. At the time had 3 sons. In Swaziland, traditionally, the queen mother must only have a single son. She came from a very minor chieftaincy, when traditionally the queen mother is either a princess from a foreign kingdom, like Ndwandwe, who was the daughter of the great Zwide, king of the Ndwandwe, or she must come from a prominent family within the nation. Labotsibeni met none of these criteria, but the force of her personality, the sharpness of her wit, overcame all of these defects. And I'm pleased to say that the Privy Council's decision was vindicated. And I think it is a peculiar feature of Swazi history that whenever the nation is in peril, some extraordinary woman seems to rise to the fore. Somjalose Simelane, Tandile Ndwandwe, and then at this moment, Labotsibeni. This is why I chose to start the series with a prelude. I wanted to gesture at this peculiar feature of Swazi history. That women play such a prominent role in the history, I would not have thought, though I myself am Swazi. So, in the next episode, we will actually begin to look at their history. We'll take a chronological view. We'll start in the mid-18th century in Delagoa Bay. We will look at the tensions between the Tembe and the nascent Dlamini clan. We will look at the Dlamini flight down past the Pongola, their collision with the Ndwandwe, their flight back up the Pongola, their settlement in the Shiselweni region, the way they built up institutions like the regiment, the Libandla, the Liqoqo, how these institutions caused tensions with the different tribes. We look at the kinship structure that fundamentally transformed what in fact was a Nguni group and then became an amalgam of a Soto and the Ngunis. We will look at the flight of a Sopuza into central and northern Swaziland. We will look at the magnificent reforms instituted by Thandile Ndwandwe, both administrative and ideological, particularly the Ingwala. We will explore the great battles in Swazi history, particularly the Battle of Lubuya against the Zulus, and the emergence of the man that would perhaps become the greatest warrior in all of Swazi history, Dambuza Lukele. We'll explore his exploits on that day. We'll look at the dynamics between the Transvaal and Swaziland. We will explore why it is probably not the case that Mbandzeni did not understand the way concessions work. But we will provide a context to explain his actions. We will look at the revolutionary transformations that took place in the Transvaal, institutional, fiscal, and demographic, that forever changed the power balance in the region. All of this we'll explore with time. So I hope you will tune in for the next episode. In the meantime, like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. Thank you.